Buju, Wago Shindagu, Migizi and Dodame, Minawa, Gaza Gasquaji Mekog, and Dunjaba. Today I'd like to share a little bit about the importance of Manoomin, or wild rice, in the Ojibwe culture. Wild rice is of course a staple food, but it is so much more than that. First of all, just around the plant itself, wild rice is technically an aquatic grass, and it has to grow in shallow muddy bottomed lakes and rivers. So northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan are well suited for wild rice, also Manitoba and Ontario. The range of wild rice used to be much larger. It went all the way down to Missouri and so forth, but the habitat has been kind of crunched in a little bit. It is a superfood, so the nutritional value is off the charts relative to many other foods with regard to its caloric content and nutritional value. And of course, a staple food for Ojibwe people. But it was so much more than that too. The Ojibwe, while our DNA is truly ancient, have moved around the continent, and a few thousand years ago were living in the eastern seaboard along the Atlantic Ocean. That land was well suited for indigenous agriculture, abundant fish in the oceans and inland lakes, large game, small game, so there was a population boom. And then cyclically, there might be a drought or a stressor, people would compete over resources, and we'd start moving around. In fact, the 29 different tribes in the Algonquian language family separated and diversified as we started to move around and spend time away from one another. During this time, there were prophets who appeared amongst the Ojibwe people that said, move west to the land where food grows on water. And we've usually understood this to be a reference to the wild rice. And so the migration happened really over a period of many hundreds of years. All of the Great Lakes was already occupied by different people. Many of the encounters were peaceful, some of them were not. And as the Ojibwe moved into the Western Great Lakes, it's really when our identity as Ojibwe people kind of cemented as different from our close cousins, the Ottawa, Potawatomi, Cree, and so forth. And it ended up being the case that wild rice was not just kind of one of the things that gave impetus to the great Ojibwe migration, but something that really empowered the entire Ojibwe population. The Western Great Lakes was full of wild rice, but also many other different food sources. So the Ojibwe had a varied supply of food, which was actually healthier and more stable. If the cranberries didn't do as well one year and the rice did better, or vice versa, people were able to compensate within the broad spectrum of food. So wild rice in the Ojibwe language is really a derivation of minnow, meaning good, and min, which is a root word pertaining to a grain or fruit, and you'll find it in many different food words. So Manoomin ended up morphing and becoming Manoomin, which is our word for wild rice. Today, it remains a staple food, and lots of people harvest wild rice. A couple of years ago, I was out at Lower Rice Lake when they had opened up the landing, and I watched 200 people launch their canoes and harvest 50,000 pounds of rice by noon. It's an incredibly abundant food and a really effective way to gather lots of food. It's a multi-million-dollar business now. Tribes like Leech Lake, White Earth, Boys Fort, and so forth buy wild rice from tribal harvesters and then process the rice, package it, and sell it to capture the value-added part of the business. So it is a multi-million-dollar business with, a marketing strategy and so forth that goes across the United States and Canada and even around the world. However, there are all kinds of challenges for the future vitality of wild rice. One of the things that has happened in terms of the marketing and distribution of wild rice is that because people pay money for it, someone has figured out how to flood a field in California, plant it, and then drain the field, run a combine, and say this is wild rice. Technically, it's a little bit different, and they're actually using a genetically modified version of wild rice. So there's been an effort to have truth in advertising. Let's call that cultivated, rice rather than wild rice. And that's an ongoing issue with regard to the sale and distribution of wild rice. In addition to that, there's a fight about the genetic modification of wild rice, because most of the food that most humans have access to in a place like the United States comes through America's chemically produced farming practices. So in other words, farmers are dumping chemicals from Monsanto onto their fields, and then of course all of that gets into the food supply. It also, when it rains, runs off and gets into the entire ecosystem. They actually recommend that you don't swim anywhere in southern Minnesota because of all of the runoff from our chemical-based farming. So as those chemicals, get into the water, the nitrate blooms choke out local vegetation, including wild rice, and the chemicals get into everything else. Well, if you can't put your toe in the water, how can you eat the food where it's dropped with GPS precision? It's just unbelievable. And most of the chemical products we use for farming in America are illegal in most other countries. And so as a result, wild rice remains one of the few foods that is not loaded with chemicals the way that so many of our other foods in our food supply are. And the fight about maintaining the integrity of wild rice is also about maintaining foods that we can get access to that are not loaded with these chemicals. And in addition to that, wild rice is facing an existential threat from climate change. As the climate shifts north, we're seeing, a weakening of the abundancy of wild rice in Michigan and Wisconsin. Minnesota, northern Minnesota still has really great wild rice, but the range of wild rice cannot keep forever drifting north, because you run into Canadian Shield country and you have, larger rocky bottomed lakes, more, widely distributed. And then you run into the Canadian plains and you just don't have the numerous shallow bottomed, muddy bottomed lakes and rivers that you do and need for wild rice to thrive. So all of those are concerns that Native people are advocating around, and education and understanding is a great part of the effort. Miigwech for listening today.
Miigwech for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer.